In Alaska's vast wilderness, people disappear and are never found again. But for the young woman who vanished in 2008, the problem wasn't nature, it was the system. The nearest police were 200 miles away, the village had no permanent law enforcement, and a labyrinth of jurisdictional authority left everyone's hands tied. 15 years later, a DNA match revealed the killer had been hiding in plain sight, right in the heart of the village. Before we dive into this story, don't forget to subscribe to the channel and hit the notification bell to stay updated on the latest cases. The summer of 2008 arrived in Kaktovik with the kind of brightness that never truly fades, the midnight sun casting an endless golden glow over the frozen tundra and the distant peaks of the Brooks Range. This Iñupiaq village, perched on the edge of the Beaufort Sea in the Arctic Circle, was home to fewer than 250 souls. There were no roads connecting it to the rest of Alaska, no highways leading to Fairbanks or Anchorage. The only way in or out was by small plane, weather permitting, or by boat during the brief months when the sea ice retreated. Life in Kaktovik moved to rhythms older than the state itself. Subsistence whaling defined the community's identity, and the successful harvest of a bowhead whale in spring was a cause for celebration that united every family. The village store, a modest building with peeling paint and a hand-painted sign, served as the social hub where residents gathered to exchange news, pick up supplies flown in at exorbitant cost, and share stories over cups of instant coffee. It was in this store that 22-year-old Nadia Apassingok worked part-time, her warm smile and easy laughter making her a favorite among the elders and children alike. Nadia had grown up in Kaktovik, learning to speak both English and Iñupiaq, her summers spent at traditional fish camps and her winters in the cramped but cozy home she shared with her grandmother. After graduating from the local school, she'd left for a year to attend the University of Alaska Fairbanks, studying natural resource management with dreams of helping her community navigate the complex world of environmental regulations and subsistence right. But the pull of home had been strong, and Nadia returned after her first year, telling friends she wasn't ready to be so far from the land and the people who raised her. She took the job at the village store, saving money and planning to return to school the following year. In the meantime, she helped her grandmother with traditional activities, learning to prepare maktak, whale skin and blubber, and to sew mukluks from caribou hide. She was, by all accounts, a young woman straddling two worlds with grace, equally comfortable discussing climate change science and the proper way to dry fish for winter storage. On the evening of August 12, 2008, Nadia closed the store at her usual time, around 8 p.m., though the sun still hung high in the Arctic sky, bathing the village in that surreal, perpetual twilight. She wore her favorite hoodie, dark blue with the UEF logo, and carried a canvas bag over her shoulder containing her water bottle, a paperback novel, and the notebook where she'd been sketching designs for a community greenhouse project. Her co-worker, an older woman named Mary, remembered Nadia being in good spirits that evening. They'd talked about an upcoming community meeting where Nadia planned to present her greenhouse idea. She was excited, Mary would later tell investigators, her voice breaking. She said she finally figured out how to keep the permafrost from undermining the foundation. She was always thinking, always planning. Nadia locked the store's door, tested it twice as she always did, and waved to Mary through the window. Then she began the short walk to her grandmother's house, a distance of perhaps half a mile along the village's main gravel road. It was a walk she'd made thousands of times since childhood, past the weathered homes with their traditional whalebone arches, past the small white church with its cross silhouetted against the endless sky, past the community center where drumming practice echoed some evenings. She never arrived home. When Nadia's grandmother, Agnes, realized her granddaughter hadn't returned by 10 p.m., she wasn't immediately alarmed. Nadia was a young woman, after all, and sometimes she stopped to visit friends or help someone with a task. But when 11 p.m. passed, then midnight, and Nadia still hadn't come through the door or called, Agnes felt the first cold fingers of worry clutch at her heart. In a village of 240 people, everyone knows everyone else's business. Agnes called Mary first, then two of Nadia's closest friends. No one had seen her. The worry began to spread like ripples in still water. By 1 a.m., a dozen villagers had gathered at Agnes's home, their faces drawn with concern. Someone suggested checking the store. Perhaps Nadia had forgotten something and gone back. A small group walked there in the strange bright night, but found only locked doors and silence. By 2 a.m., the informal search had expanded. Men and women walked the village's few streets, calling Nadia's name, checking every building, every shed, every possible place she might have stopped. The village had no police station, no resident trooper. Law enforcement in Kaktovik, as in many bush Alaska communities, was an irregular presence at best. The nearest Alaska State Troopers post was in the regional hub of Barrow, now called Iñupiaq, more than 200 miles to the west. And even reaching them in the middle of the night, even getting a message through, even getting them to respond, all of that took time that felt increasingly precious. At 3:30 a.m., with the sun still circling the horizon in its endless summer loop, one of the searchers found Nadia's canvas bag lying in the tall grass behind the community center. The water bottle had rolled out and the notebook lay open, its pages fluttering in the Arctic breeze. But there was no sign of Nadia herself, no indication of where she'd gone or why she'd dropped her belongings. That's when panic truly set in. Agnes collapsed into a chair, her weathered hands shaking as neighbors tried to comfort her. The village's tribal council president, a man named Thomas Brower, immediately tried to reach the Alaska State Troopers by satellite phone, the village's only reliable connection to the outside world when weather interfered with radio signals. It took 40 minutes to get through. The dispatcher in Barrow listened to Thomas's urgent report, took down the information, and said she would relay it to the on-duty troopers. Then came the words that would haunt the community for years. Weather is bad between here and Kaktovik. Earliest we can get a plane out is probably this afternoon, maybe tomorrow morning depending on conditions. Thomas felt his stomach drop. A young woman is missing, he said, trying to keep his voice steady. We need someone here now. I understand, sir, the dispatcher replied, her tone professional but distant. But we can't fly in these conditions. It's not safe. The troopers will get there as soon as physically possible. And that was that. In the lower 48, a missing person report involving a young woman would trigger an immediate response, squad cars converging, helicopters in the air, Amber Alerts issued. But in bush Alaska, where geography imposes its own brutal calculus, as soon as physically possible could mean days. The community didn't wait. As dawn broke, or rather, as the sun climbed slightly higher in its circular path, volunteers organized a more systematic search. They divided the village into grids, checked every structure, and began expanding outward into the tundra. The landscape beyond the village was treacherous. Uneven ground concealing deep holes, marshes that could swallow a person, and the ever-present danger of polar bears, which had been spotted near the village just weeks earlier. By noon on August 13th, more than 100 people, nearly half the village's population, had joined the search. They found nothing. No footprints leading away from where the bag was discovered, no torn clothing, no signs of struggle. It was as if Nadia had simply ceased to exist the moment she stepped behind the community center. The weather that had grounded the state troopers finally cleared late on August 14. Nearly 40 hours after Nadia was reported missing, a small floatplane carrying 2 Alaska State Troopers touched down on the Beaufort Sea near the village. Sergeant Michael Reeves and Trooper Jennifer Walsh stepped onto the rocky shore, their equipment bags heavy with investigation gear that would prove woefully inadequate for what they were about to encounter. Thomas Brower and 3 council members met them at the shoreline. "Thank you for coming," Thomas said, though his tone carried an edge of bitterness. "It's been almost 2 days." Sergeant Reeves, a weathered man in his 50s with 2 decades of experience in rural Alaska policing, understood the accusation beneath those words. "I know," he said simply. "Show us what you've found." What they found was both everything and nothing. The canvas bag and its contents were carefully preserved, untouched since their discovery. Reeves photographed everything in place before collecting the items as evidence. The notebook was particularly poignant, its pages filled with Nadia's careful handwriting and detailed sketches of greenhouse designs, solar panel configurations, and notes about cold-hardy vegetable varieties. The last entry was dated August 11th, the day before she disappeared. Talk to Elder Joseph about traditional food preservation. He thinks the greenhouse could work if we build it strong enough. Hope lives in small things. Trooper Walsh conducted interviews while Reeves processed the scene. Person after person told the same story. Nadia was loved, had no enemies, no romantic troubles that anyone knew of, no reason to run away, and certainly no means to leave the village unnoticed. Every plane that landed was noticed by someone. Every boat departure was community knowledge. And Nadia, with her close relationship to her grandmother and her deep roots in village life, had no history of impulsive behavior. The troopers expanded their search into the tundra, but here they encountered the Arctic's implacable reality. The ground, with its mix of permafrost, marsh, and seasonal vegetation, held no clear track. 2 days of weather, of wind, and the trampling of 100 searchers had obliterated any potential evidence. If Nadia had walked away from the village, or been carried away, the land had already swallowed the proof. On the 3rd day of their investigation, August 16th, a villager searching along the coastline found what everyone had been dreading. Nadia's body lay among the rocks at the base of a low bluff, partially concealed by driftwood and kelp. She was still wearing her blue UEF hoodie. The tide had come and gone twice since she was placed there, washing away potential evidence with cold efficiency. Dr. Helena Vasquez, the medical examiner flown in from Anchorage later that week, would determine that Nadia had died from blunt force trauma to the head and had been manually strangled. The injuries suggested a violent, personal attack. The condition of the body, compromised by exposure and tidal action, made determining the exact time of death difficult, but it was consistent with the evening she disappeared. Tissue samples were carefully collected for DNA analysis, though in 2008, the technology and databases available were far more limited than they would become in subsequent years. The investigation that followed was hampered from the start by the realities of bush, Alaska policing. Sergeant Reeves and Trooper Walsh could only remain in Kaktovik for 5 days before budget and personnel constraints forced them to return to Barrow. They interviewed every adult in the village, took DNA samples from those willing to provide them, and photographed the crime scene exhaustively. But the truth was, they had few leads and fewer resources. The tissue samples collected from beneath Nadia's fingernails, evidence that she'd fought her attacker, were sent to the Alaska State Crime Lab in Anchorage, where they would be processed and entered into CODIS, the National DNA Database. But in 2008, CODIS contained profiles primarily from convicted offenders, arrestees in certain states, and unsolved crime scene evidence. If Nadia's killer had never been arrested, never had their DNA collected for any reason, they simply wouldn't be in the system. The investigation identified several persons of interest. There was Marcus Amrogak, a 34-year-old man who worked seasonally on the North Slope oil fields and had returned to the village just 3 days before Nadia disappeared. Some villagers mentioned he'd made Nadia uncomfortable with unwanted attention at a community gathering the previous month. Marcus voluntarily provided a DNA sample and had an alibi. He'd been at a poker game with 5 other men the night Nadia vanished. The timeline checked out, and his DNA didn't match the samples from the crime scene. Then there was David Kaglick, Nadia's ex-boyfriend from high school. Their relationship had ended 2 years earlier when Nadia left for college, reportedly amicably, but investigators in any missing person case always look closely at romantic connections. David, now 24 and working as a heavy equipment operator, was devastated by Nadia's death. He'd been among the most dedicated searchers, spending 18 hours straight combing the tundra. His DNA sample also came back negative, and his alibi for the critical hours was solid. He'd been on a satellite phone call with his supervisor in Deadhorse, discussing a work schedule from 7:30 to 9 p.m., confirmed by phone record. A third person of interest emerged more quietly. Robert Kunuk, a 45-year-old maintenance worker at the village school, had lived in Kaktovik for 6 years, having moved there from Nome for the job. He was quiet, kept to himself, and lived alone in a small house near the edge of the village. Several people mentioned that Robert had volunteered to help with the search, had stood with Agnes at her kitchen table marking off grid coordinates on a map, had handed out coffee to exhausted searchers. But Robert had no clear alibi for the evening of August 12. He said he'd been home alone, watching a movie on DVD. The village had satellite TV and internet, though both were expensive and unreliable. No one could verify his statement. Still, without physical evidence linking him to the crime, and with his DNA sample showing no match to the crime scene material, there was nothing investigators could do. Robert Canuck remained a person of interest, a name in a file, but nothing more. The tissue samples that didn't match any known suspect were entered into Cody's as an unsolved case profile, given a reference number, and filed. The Alaska State Troopers classified Nadia Apassingok's case as an active investigation, but with no new leads, no witnesses coming forward, and no forensic breakthroughs, it effectively went cold by the end of 2008. For Agnes, the months that followed Nadia's death were a blur of unbearable pain. The traditional Iñupiaq funeral honored Nadia's life, the entire village gathering to share stories, sing traditional songs, and commit her body to the frozen ground in the small cemetery overlooking the sea. Agnes, who had raised Nadia after her daughter, Nadia's mother, died in a boating accident when Nadia was only 4, felt as though she'd been hollowed out. She'd survived the death of her husband, the death of her daughter, the harsh realities of Arctic life. But this, the violent theft of her granddaughter's future, felt like too much to bear. The first year was the hardest. Every time Agnes walked past the village store, she saw Nadia's smile. Every time she heard young people laughing, she heard Nadia's voice. The greenhouse project that Nadia had been so excited about remained just sketches in a notebook sealed in an evidence box in Anchorage. Agnes tried to continue her traditional activities, cutting fish in autumn, preparing for winter, but her heart wasn't in it. Friends and neighbors did their best to support her, bringing food, sitting with her during the darkest days of winter when the sun didn't rise at all. The second year brought a different kind of pain, the pain of watching the world move on while she remained frozen. The village returned to its rhythms. Babies were born, elders passed away, the whaling season came and went. The Alaska State Troopers sent occasional updates that contained no real information. The case remained open, they assured her, but there were no new leads. Agnes began to understand what thousands of other Native families across Alaska and the lower 48 already knew. When a Native woman disappeared or was murdered, the investigation often ended in silence. By the third year, Agnes had joined a support group for families of missing and murdered Indigenous people, meeting via conference call with women from villages across Alaska, from the Yukon-Kuskokwim Delta to the Aleutian Islands. She learned the statistics that would later be confirmed by federal studies. 84.3% of Alaska Native and American Indian women experience violence in their lifetime. 56.1% experience sexual violence. For Native women aged 1 to 45, homicide is among the top 10 causes of death. And somewhere around 4,200 missing and murdered Indigenous people cases remained unsolved across the United States. Agnes also learned about the systemic failures that allowed these numbers to grow. The jurisdictional maze that made it unclear who had authority to investigate crimes in Native villages. The lack of permanent law enforcement in most bush communities. Approximately 1/3 of Alaska Native villages had no permanent police presence whatsoever. The delayed response times that allowed evidence to be destroyed and witnesses to be intimidated. The underfunded crime labs that couldn't process evidence quickly enough. The cultural disconnect between mostly white law enforcement and Native communities that led to distrust and communication breakdowns. What Agnes learned made her angry, an anger that burned hotter than her grief. This wasn't just about Nadia anymore. This was about a system that treated Native women as less deserving of protection, as acceptable losses in a vast state where geography and budget constraints created a convenient excuse for doing nothing. In 2011, 3 years after Nadia's death, Agnes traveled to Juneau for a legislative hearing on public safety in rural Alaska. She was 68 years old, and the journey from Kaktovik required 3 different plane rides and help from a non-profit that funded her ticket. But Agnes stood before the Alaska Legislature's Finance Committee and spoke for 15 minutes about her granddaughter, about the 2-day delay in trooper response, about the unsolved case that haunted her community. Nadia was brilliant, Agnes said, her voice steady despite her trembling hands. She wanted to help our people grow fresh food in the Arctic. She wanted to bridge the old ways and the new ways. But someone took her from us, and the system that was supposed to protect her couldn't even get police to our village for 2 days. If this happened in Anchorage, in Juneau, would you wait 2 days to send help? We are Alaska citizens too. Our lives matter too. Or do they? The room was silent. Several legislators shifted uncomfortably. One wiped her eyes. A staff member quietly took note. But when Agnes finished speaking and returned to Kaktovik 2 days later, nothing changed. The legislature increased funding for Alaska state troopers slightly in the next budget cycle, but the money went primarily to urban and road-connected areas. The bush villages, where the need was greatest, remained at the bottom of the priority list. Years passed. Nadia's case file remained open but dormant, one folder among hundreds of unsolved homicides statewide. Sergeant Reeves retired in 2014. Trooper Walsh transferred to a position in Fairbanks. New investigators in the cold case unit would occasionally review Nadia's file, note the lack of leads, and move on to cases where they believed they had a better chance of success. In Kaktovik, life continued. New children were born, learned to speak Iñupiaq, went to school in the building where Robert Kunuk still worked maintenance. He remained a quiet fixture in the village, never causing trouble, helpful when asked, but keeping mostly to himself. Some villagers remembered that he'd been a person of interest briefly, but without any evidence against him, and with his DNA cleared through official channels, suspicion faded. Besides, in a village of 240 people, you couldn't afford to completely ostracize someone based on unfounded suspicions. Community cohesion was necessary for survival. Robert Kunuk understood this dynamic perfectly. He'd built a life in Kaktovik that was carefully unremarkable. He maintained the school's boiler system, fixed broken pipes, and ensured the generators ran smoothly through the brutal winters. He received his Alaska Permanent Fund dividend check every October like everyone else. In 2008, it had been $2,069 per person, a significant sum in the cash-poor bush economy. He even donated a portion of his dividend to the Crime Victim Compensation Fund through the Optional Contribution Program, a gesture of community solidarity that some villagers noted approvingly. What Robert understood, what he'd counted on from the very beginning, was that Alaska's geography and systemic failures had created a perfect environment for getting away with murder. The 2-day delay in law enforcement response had allowed the tide to wash away crucial evidence. The limited DNA databases in 2008 meant that as long as he'd never been arrested, his genetic material was anonymous. The villagers' focus on outside suspects, the oilfield worker, the ex-boyfriend, had provided convenient distractions. And the sheer statistical likelihood that Nadia's case would become one of thousands of unsolved Native women murders meant that time was on his side. But Robert Kunuk couldn't have anticipated the revolution that was coming in forensic science, or the stubborn persistence of an old woman who refused to let her granddaughter be forgotten, or the simple fact that he would eventually make one careless mistake in a coffee shop 15 years after he thought he'd gotten away with the perfect crime. The breakthrough that would eventually solve Nadia Apassingok's case began not in Alaska, but in a genetic genealogy company's database in Utah. In the years following 2008, the explosive growth of consumer DNA testing companies like 23andMe, Ancestry DNA, and smaller services created a new resource for law enforcement. GEDmatch, a free genetic genealogy website where users could upload their DNA results from various companies to search for relative. By 2018, the world had been shocked by the arrest of the Golden State Killer, a serial rapist and murderer who had evaded capture for decades until investigators used genetic genealogy to identify him through distant relatives' DNA in public databases. The technique was revolutionary, Investigators could upload DNA from a crime scene to genealogy, identify distant genetic cousins, build a family tree, and narrow down potential suspects to a handful of individuals who match the right age, location, and circumstances. The success of that case and others like it sparked a national conversation about the ethics of using genetic genealogy for law enforcement purposes. Privacy advocates worried about the implications of police accessing databases that people had submitted to in order to find long-lost cousins, not to implicate relatives in crimes. But for families of cold case victims, including the families of missing and murdered Indigenous women, genetic genealogy represented hope where none had existed before. In 2021, the Alaska State Troopers Cold Case Investigation Unit received a federal grant specifically designated for using advanced forensic techniques on unsolved Native American cases. The grant, part of Operation Lady Justice and subsequent federal initiatives targeting the MMIP crisis, provided funding for genetic genealogy analyses on up to 20 Alaska cases where traditional DNA database searches had failed. Detective Sarah Chen, who joined the Cold Case Unit in 2019, had been pushing for this kind of specialized funding since she arrived. Chen, a second-generation Chinese American from Juneau, had developed a reputation for meticulous case review and a particular sensitivity to cases involving Alaska Native victims. When she pulled Nadia Apassingok's file in early 2022 as one of the grant-funded cases, she was struck by the familiar pattern. Delayed law enforcement response, evidence compromised by environmental factors, a small suspect pool that had been exhausted without results. But Chen noticed something that previous investigators had noted but not fully pursued. The DNA profile extracted from beneath Nadia's fingernails in 2008 was partial but good quality for the technology of the time. It had been run through Cody's periodically over the years with no hit. But it had never been uploaded to genealogy or similar genealogy databases because, until recently, Alaska hadn't had the funding or expertise to do so. Chen contacted Parabon Nanolabs, a Virginia-based company specializing in genetic genealogy for law enforcement. For a fee covered by the federal grant, Parabon could take the DNA profile, upload it to genealogy databases, identify genetic relatives, and work with their team of genealogists to build a family tree that might lead to a suspect. The process took months. In June 2022, Parabon's lead genealogist, Dr. Margaret Holloway, called Chen with preliminary result. "We have several genetic matches," Holloway explained. "Third and fourth cousins, mostly. The genetic profile suggests European and East Asian ancestry, which is not uncommon in Alaska given the historical mixing of populations. I'm building out family trees now, looking for common ancestors." By September 2022, Holloway had narrowed the potential suspect pool to 3 family lines, all with historical roots in Alaska. One line traced back to Norwegian fishermen who'd settled in the Aleutians in the early 1900s. Another connected to Russian Aleut families from the colonial era. The third line was more recent, Korean War veterans who'd come to Alaska in the 1950s and 60s, marrying into local communities. The challenge was that all 3 family lines had multiple living male descendants in the right age range who could theoretically match the profile. Holloway and Chen worked together to cross-reference these names with Alaska records. Driver's licenses, voter registration, permanent fund dividend applications, employment records, and any connection to Kaktovik or the North Slope region in 2008. One name appeared on multiple lists: Robert Kunuk. Or rather, the name he was born with. Robert Wayne Peak, son of John Peak, a Korean-American veteran who'd worked on the DW line radar stations in the 1960s, and Sarah Kunuk, an Iñupiaq woman from Point Hope. Robert had taken his mother's surname after his father abandoned the family when Robert was 7. Detective Chen felt her pulse quicken as she reviewed Robert P. Kunuk's history. Born in 1963 in Nome, he'd bounced between villages and urban centers throughout his childhood. He had a juvenile record that was sealed but referenced in other documents, some kind of assault incident when he was 16. As an adult, He'd worked various maintenance and construction jobs, never staying anywhere long until he took the school maintenance position in Kaktovik in 2002. Most significantly, Chern found records showing Robert had been a person of interest in Nadia's case. His DNA had been collected and run through Cody's in 2008 with no match. But Chern understood why. The DNA sample collected from Robert in 2008 had been a cheek swab for comparison purposes. What she didn't immediately see in the file was whether that sample had been properly preserved and stored, or whether it had been destroyed after the initial Cody's comparison came back negative. She called the Alaska State Crime Lab in Anchorage. After an hour of searching, a lab technician named Kevin Rodriguez found the answer in archived records. Robert Kunuk's 2008 DNA sample had been preserved in frozen storage, standard protocol for DNA collected in homicide investigations. It was still there, a small vial in a vast freezer, waiting. "I need that sample," Chern told Rodriguez. "And I need it compared to the crime scene DNA from Nadia Apassingok. Not just Cody's markers. Full profile comparison." Rodriguez understood the implications. "You think the 2008 comparison missed something?" "I think the technology in 2008 couldn't detect what we can detect now," Chern replied. "And I think genetic genealogy just told us where to look." The comparison took 2 weeks. When the results came back, Chern was sitting at her desk in the cold case unit's cramped office in Anchorage, reviewing other case files while she waited. Her phone rang, Rodriguez's number appearing on the screen. "Detective Chern," Rodriguez said, his voice tight with controlled excitement. "It's a match. Full profile, 99.999% probability. Robert Kunuk's 2008 DNA sample matches the DNA profile extracted from beneath Nadia Apassingok's fingernails." Chern closed her eyes, feeling the weight of 14 years of injustice pressing down on her. "How did the 2008 comparison miss it?" Rodriguez explained. "The Cody's system in 2008 used 13 core STR markers for comparison. The sample from the crime scene was degraded enough that some markers gave ambiguous result. Robert Kunuk's reference sample also had some technical issues in the original processing. When the lab tech in 2008 ran the comparison, enough markers were unclear that the system couldn't call it a definitive match or exclusion. It was essentially an inconclusive result, but the way it was recorded in the file made it look like a negative. Today's technology uses more markers, better analysis software, and we have better DNA extraction techniques for degraded samples. When I ran the full modern comparison, it's absolutely conclusive." Chen felt rage and relief warring in her chest. A technical limitation and reporting error 14 years ago had allowed a murderer to remain free, had allowed him to continue living in the same village where he'd killed a young woman, had allowed Agnes to spend 14 years without answers. "Kevin," Chen said carefully, "I need you to write this up as a formal report. I need every detail documented. And I need it yesterday." Within 24 hours, Chern had briefed her supervisor, the cold case unit commander, and the district attorney's office in Fairbanks, which handled major crimes for the North Slope region. By the end of the week, a team was assembled. Chen as lead investigator, 2 Alaska State troopers for the arrest operation, a prosecutor from the DA's office, and a victim advocate who would be responsible for notifying Agnes before news of the arrest became public. The plan was to arrest Robert Kunuk in Anchorage, not Kaktovik. Records showed that Robert was scheduled to fly to Anchorage in early October 2022 for his annual medical checkup, a trip he made every year, paid for by his school district health insurance. Arresting him in Kaktovik would have been logistically complex and potentially dangerous if he resisted, and it would have immediately traumatized the small community. Better to take him in the city, where resources and backup were plentiful. On October 8, 2022, Robert Kunuk landed at Ted Stevens Anchorage International Airport on an Alaska Airlines flight from Iñupiaq. He collected his small carry-on bag, walked through the terminal, and headed toward the rental car counter. He never made it. Detective Chern and 2 uniformed troopers intercepted him near the baggage claim. "Robert Kunuk?" Chern said, showing her badge. Robert's face went carefully neutral, but Chun, trained to read micro-expressions, saw the flash of calculation in his eyes. Yes. I'm Detective Chun with the Alaska State Troopers Cold Case Unit. I need you to come with us. We have some questions about an incident in Kaktovik in 2008. Robert didn't resist. He simply nodded, set down his bag, and held out his wrist. You'll want these, I assume. The troopers cuffed him, read him his Miranda rights, and led him through the airport. Travelers stared, took photos with their phones. Robert kept his eyes down, his face expressionless. At the Anchorage State Trooper headquarters, Robert was processed and placed in an interview room. Detective Chun let him sit for an hour, a standard technique allowing suspects to marinate in their own anxiety. She used the time to call Agnes in Kaktovik. The victim advocate, a woman named Louise Martin who'd worked with MMIP families for years, was on the call too, sitting in Agnes's living room. Agnes was 82 now, her hair completely white, her hands gnarled from decades of traditional work. When Chun explained that they'd arrested someone for Nadia's murder, Agnes made a sound that was half sob, half gasp. Who? Agnes whispered. Who did this? Robert Kunuk, Chun said gently. The school maintenance worker. DNA evidence proves he killed Nadia. I'm so sorry it took this long. The silence on the line stretched for several seconds. Then Agnes spoke, her voice hardening. Robert? He was here. He helped search. He stood in my kitchen. Another pause. He's been living here for 14 years. Walking past me in the store. Fixing the school where Nadia went to school. I know, Chun said. I know, and I'm sorry. He's in custody now. He won't hurt anyone else. We're going to do everything we can to get justice for Nadia. After the call ended, Chun sat in her office for a moment, steadying herself. Then she picked up the recording equipment and headed to the interview room. Robert Kunuk sat at the metal table, his hands folded, his expression calm. He was 59 years old now, gray-haired, still lean from years of physical labor. When Chun entered with Sergeant Tom Brandt, another cold case investigator, Robert looked up without apparent concern. Chun went through the formalities, establishing the date, time, the presence of recording equipment, Robert's understanding of his rights. Then she opened the case file on the table. Robert, we arrested you today because we have DNA evidence that proves you killed Nadia Apassingok on August 12, 2008. Robert's expression didn't change. He simply nodded slightly, as if she'd remarked on the weather. Would you like to tell us what happened that night? Chun asked. For a long moment, Robert said nothing. Then, almost conversationally, he began to speak. I didn't plan it, he said. That's what you need to understand. I didn't wake up that morning thinking I was going to kill anyone. But Nadia, she had this way of looking at you like she could see inside your head. Made me uncomfortable. Chun kept her face neutral, though her stomach turned. What happened when she left the store that night? Robert shifted in his chair. I'd been watching her for a while. Not in a creepy way, he added, as if this clarification mattered. I just found her interesting. Smart girl. Too smart, maybe. That night, I was walking back from the community center. There'd been a meeting about fuel oil deliveries for winter. I saw her locking up the store. I followed her. Why? Sergeant Brandt asked. Robert shrugged. Wanted to talk to her. About her greenhouse project. I'd heard her talking about it. I thought maybe I could help, you know? I'm good with construction. Chun knew this was a lie, or at least a rationalization constructed after the fact. But she let him continue. I called out to her when she was walking past the community center. She stopped, turned around. She recognized me, said hello. I started talking about the greenhouse, and she was polite, but I could tell she wanted to get home. She kept looking past me, toward her grandmother's house. It made me angry. Here I was, trying to help, and she couldn't even give me 5 minutes of her time. Robert's voice had taken on an edge now, the careful calm slipping. I asked her if she wanted to see some lumber I had stored behind the community center, thought maybe it would work for the greenhouse frame. She said no, she needed to get home. I insisted. She got that look on her face, That look young women get when they're trying to be polite but they're scared. That look made me angrier. What did you do? Chen asked, her voice steady despite the rage building in her chest. I grabbed her arm, just to stop her from walking away. But she jerked back, told me to let go. Her voice got loud. I panicked. There were still people out, it was summer, broad daylight all night. Someone might hear. So I pulled her behind the community center, into the tall grass. She started screaming. I put my hand over her mouth. She bit me. Robert held up his right hand, showing a faint scar on his palm. Bit me hard enough to draw blood. So I hit her. Just to make her stop. But she kept fighting, kept trying to scream. Her nails dug into my face, my neck. He touched his throat, remembering. I just wanted her to be quiet. I didn't think about what I was doing. I just squeezed until she stopped. The room was silent except for the hum of the recording equipment. Chen's hands were clenched beneath the table, her nails digging into her palms. Sergeant Brandt's jaw was tight. What did you do after she was dead? Chen asked. I panicked, Robert said, his voice becoming flat, emotionless. I knew I'd made a terrible mistake. I couldn't think. I just knew I had to hide what happened. I carried her to my house. It was only 200 yards away, and there was no one around right then. I kept her in my shed for a few hours, trying to figure out what to do. Then, in the middle of the night, I carried her down to the coastline. I knew the tide schedule. Everyone in the village knows the tides. I put her among the rocks where I knew the water would reach. I thought the ocean would take her, wash her out to sea. But I didn't count on the driftwood trapping her there. You dropped her bag behind the community center to make it look like that's where she disappeared, Chen said. It wasn't a question. Yes. Later that night, after I'd taken her to the coast, I went back and scattered the things from her bag. Made it look like something sudden had happened there. Robert paused. Then I went home and waited. When the search started, I joined in. It seemed like the thing to do. Stay visible. Be helpful. You stood in Agnes's kitchen, Chen said, her voice hardening. You handed out coffee to people searching for a woman you'd murdered. Robert met her eyes for the first time. I know how it sounds. But I did feel bad. I do feel bad. I never meant for any of it to happen. It was just one of those things that spirals out of control. One of those things, Brandt repeated, his voice dripping with disgust. You murdered a 22-year-old woman because she didn't want to look at your lumber. You strangled her with your bare hands. You hid her body and let her grandmother suffer for 14 years thinking her granddaughter's killer was walking free. That's not one of those things, Robert. That's evil. Robert looked down at the table, saying nothing. Chen leaned forward. How did you feel when the troopers took your DNA sample in 2008? For the first time, Robert smiled slightly. Honestly? Scared at first. But then when nothing happened, when they told me I was cleared, I figured I'd gotten away with it. I didn't really understand DNA back then. I thought if they tested me and didn't arrest me, I was safe. Did you ever think about leaving Kaktovik? Chen asked. Sometimes. But leaving would have looked suspicious. And besides, Robert shrugged, I liked it there. Good job, decent pay, people mostly left me alone. After a few years, I barely thought about what happened. It was like it happened to someone else. The interview continued for another hour. Robert provided details that only the killer could know, details that had never been released to the public. The exact position of Nadia's body among the rock. The fact that her hoodie had ridden up in the struggle, exposing her lower back. The way her notebook had landed open to a specific page. Every detail matched the crime scene photos and investigator notes from 2008. When the interview concluded, Robert was formally charged with first-degree murder. Because Alaska had abolished capital punishment in 1957, he faced a sentence of 99 years without the possibility of parole. The charges were filed in Fairbanks Superior Court, as Kaktovik fell under the jurisdiction of the 4th Judicial District. News of the arrest spread through Alaska like wildfire. The Anchorage Daily News ran a front-page story. DNA match solves 14-year-old Kaktovik murder. The story detailed Nadia's death, the delays in the original investigation, and the genetic genealogy breakthrough that had finally identified her killer. For Alaska Native communities still reeling from the ongoing MMIP crisis, Nadia's case represented something rare. Actual resolution, actual justice, even if it came far too late. In Kaktovik, the news hit like a bomb. Residents were stunned, horrified, angry. Robert Kunuk had been part of their community for 20 years. He'd fixed their heating systems, kept their school running, attended community events. Some had considered him a friend. The betrayal was profound. A village meeting was called at the community center, the same building behind which Nadia had been attacked. More than 150 people crowded into the space, from elders to teenagers who'd been toddlers when Nadia died. Thomas Brower, still the tribal council president after all these years, opened the meeting. "I know everyone is shocked, angry, confused," Thomas said, his voice heavy. "We all have questions about how this happened. How someone could live among us for so long after doing something so terrible. But right now, I want us to focus on Agnes and on honoring Nadia's memory. Agnes, would you like to say anything?" Agnes stood slowly, using a cane now, her body bent with age and grief. When she spoke, her voice was surprisingly strong. "For 14 years, I lit a candle every night for my granddaughter. Every single night, asking the Creator to bring her justice. I thought I would die without knowing who took her from us. But today I know. Today there is justice." She paused, tears streaming down her weathered face. "Robert, if you're listening somehow, I want you to know, Nadia was worth 100 of you. She was going to do great things. And you took that from all of us. I hope you spend the rest of your life thinking about what you destroyed." The room erupted in applause and sobs. People held each other, cried together, shared memories of Nadia. Some expressed anger at the Alaska State Troopers for missing the DNA match in 2008. Others directed their fury at the systemic neglect that allowed bush villages to operate without permanent law enforcement, that made Agnes wait 2 days for troopers to arrive, that had created the conditions where Robert Kunuk felt safe enough to commit murder. Tribal Council member Sarah Kaktovik, herself a survivor of assault, spoke up. "This is not just about Nadia, and it's not just about Robert. This is about a system that treats Native lives as less important than other lives. If Nadia had disappeared in Anchorage, troopers would have been there in minutes. But we're out here in the bush, so we waited 2 days. How many other women have we lost because help arrives too late? How many killers walk free because there's no police presence to deter them?" Her words sparked a long discussion about what the village could do. Some advocated for hiring their own police force using tribal resources. Others pointed out the prohibitive costs and the complex jurisdictional issues. Villages had limited authority to enforce laws, especially against non-native offenders. The conversation eventually turned to the Violence Against Women Act reauthorization of 2022, which had just created a pilot program allowing certain Alaska tribes to exercise special criminal jurisdiction over crimes committed in their villages, even by non-natives. "We need to apply for that program," Sarah said firmly. "We need to take control of our own safety. The state has proven they can't protect us." In the months following Robert's arrest, as the case moved toward trial, more details emerged about his past. Investigative journalists discovered that Robert's sealed juvenile record involved an assault on a teenage girl in Nome in 1979. The case had been handled by juvenile authorities and never resulted in adult charges or DNA collection. After that incident, Robert had drifted between villages, never staying long, working short-term jobs. In several communities, there were whispered rumors about his behavior around young women. Nothing concrete enough for charges, but enough to make some families warn their daughters to avoid him. These warnings had never coalesced into any kind of formal complaint or investigation. The pattern painted a picture of a predator who had learned to exploit the gaps in Alaska's rural justice system. Villages without permanent police, where reporting a crime meant trying to reach distant troopers by satellite phone. Communities where men outnumbered women and traditional hierarchies sometimes protected abusers. A legal system fragmented by jurisdictional complexity, where it was unclear whether tribal, state, or federal authorities had primary responsibility for prosecution. In March 2023, Robert Kunuk's trial began in Fairbanks Superior Court. The proceedings lasted 2 weeks. The prosecution presented overwhelming evidence. The DNA match, Robert's confession, corroborating details from the crime scene, and testimony from forensic experts explaining how the 2008 DNA comparison had failed due to technical limitations and reporting errors. Robert's defense attorney, a public defender named Michael Torres, faced an impossible task. He couldn't dispute the DNA evidence or the confession. Instead, he attempted to argue for a lesser charge of second-degree murder, claiming Robert hadn't premeditated the killing but had acted in a moment of panic and rage. The argument fell flat with the jury, who saw in Robert's confession a deliberate attempt to isolate Nadia, to silence her, and to hide his crime through calculated steps. The trial also featured powerful victim impact statements. Agnes, now 83, traveled to Fairbanks with the help of a victim advocacy organization. She testified about Nadia's life, her dreams, her love for her community and her culture. She described the 14 years of pain, of not knowing, of watching Robert walk freely through the village. "He didn't just kill my granddaughter," Agnes said from the witness stand, her voice shaking but clear. "He killed a piece of our entire community. Nadia was going to help us build that greenhouse. She was going to help us preserve our traditional knowledge while adapting to climate change. She was going to be a bridge between the old ways and the new ways. Robert took all of that from us, and then he lived among us, pretending to be one of us, for 14 years. That is a special kind of evil." Several of Nadia's former classmates and friends also testified, painting a picture of a vibrant young woman whose loss had reverberated through the community. Mary, the coworker who'd been the last person to see Nadia alive at the store, broke down sobbing on the stand as she recounted their final conversation about the greenhouse project. The prosecution also called Detective Sarah Chun, who explained the genetic genealogy process that had led to Robert's identification. Her testimony highlighted both the power of new forensic technology and the tragedy of the 2008 oversight that had allowed Robert to remain free for so long. "Modern DNA analysis would have caught this match in 2008 if we'd had the technology we have now," Chun testified. "But more than that, if the lab technician who recorded the original results had noted it as inconclusive rather than negative, Robert Kunuk would have remained under scrutiny. Instead, he was effectively cleared, and the investigation moved on. That's on us. That's on the system." On March 24, 2023, after only 4 hours of deliberation, the jury returned a verdict: guilty of first-degree murder. The courtroom erupted in sobs and applause. Agnes covered her face with her hands, her shoulders heaving. Supporters from Kaktovik who'd made the journey to Fairbanks embraced each other, tears streaming. Robert Kunuk showed no emotion as the verdict was read. When Superior Court Judge Patricia Hansen asked if he had anything to say before sentencing, he stood and spoke briefly. "I'm sorry for what I did. I've lived with it every day for 15 years. I know that doesn't mean anything to Agnes or to Nadia's friends and family, but it's the truth. I was a coward. I'm still a coward. I deserve whatever punishment you give me." Judge Hansen's response was withering. "Mr. Kunuk, you had 15 years to come forward. 15 years to confess. 15 years to give Agnes Apassingok closure. You chose not to. You chose instead to insert yourself into the investigation, to stand beside the family of the woman you murdered, to accept their gratitude for helping search for her. That goes beyond cowardice. That demonstrates a profound moral bankruptcy." She sentenced him to 99 years without the possibility of parole, the maximum sentence under Alaska law. Robert would spend the rest of his life in Spring Creek Correctional Center in Seward, Alaska's only maximum security prison. At 59 years old, barring extraordinary circumstances, he would die in prison. After the trial, Detective Chun and the Alaska State Troopers Cold Case Unit faced scrutiny over the 2008 DNA processing error. An internal review was launched, examining protocols for how DNA comparisons were conducted, how results were recorded, and how inconclusive results were communicated to investigators. The review found that the 2008 error was not unique. Several other cold cases had potentially been impacted by similar technical limitations and reporting ambiguities. The Alaska Department of Public Safety announced new protocols. All DNA evidence from unsolved homicides would be retested using modern technology. All previous negative results would be reviewed to determine if they were actually inconclusive, and genetic genealogy would be employed on any case where traditional CODIS searches had failed. The changes came too late for Nadia, but offered hope for other families still waiting for answers. The Alaska legislature, spurred by renewed attention to the MMIP crisis and the specifics of Nadia's case, passed new legislation in 2023. The bills included mandatory reporting of missing persons to the National Missing and Unidentified Persons System, NAMUS, within 60 days, increased funding for Alaska State Troopers positions specifically dedicated to rural communities, and grants for tribal governments seeking to establish their own police forces under the VAWA 2022 pilot program. Kaktovik's Tribal Council was among the first to apply for the VAWA pilot program. In late 2023, they received approval to establish special criminal tribal jurisdiction over certain crimes committed in the village, including domestic violence, sexual assault, and stalking, even when committed by non-native offenders. The village hired 2 tribal police officers, both Alaska natives with law enforcement training, who would work in coordination with Alaska State Troopers but provide immediate, permanent police presence for the first time in the village's modern history. "This is what Nadia's legacy should be," Thomas Brower said at the ceremony inaugurating the tribal police force in January 2024. "Not just that her killer was caught, but that we refused to let another generation of our young people grow up in a village without protection. We owe that to Nadia. We owe that to every Native woman who has disappeared or been murdered in Alaska." Agnes lived to see these changes implemented. In her final years, she became a prominent advocate for MMIP awareness, speaking at legislative hearings, tribal gatherings, and victim advocacy conferences across Alaska. She kept Nadia's greenhouse notebook with her always, its pages now protected in clear plastic sleeves, a testament to the dreams that had died on that August night in 2008. In the spring of 2024, the Kaktovik community broke ground on a project they named Nadia's Garden. Using funds from state grants, private donations, and Agnes's own permanent fund dividend contributions over several years, they built the greenhouse Nadia had designed in her notebook. The structure rose from the permafrost using the foundation techniques Nadia had sketched, incorporating both traditional knowledge and modern engineering. Solar panels on the roof provided power for grow lights during the dark winter month. The greenhouse opened in August 2024, exactly 16 years after Nadia's death. It was filled with cold hardy vegetables, traditional plants used in Iñupiaq medicine, and a small section dedicated to Arctic wildflowers. A plaque near the entrance bore Nadia's photograph and a quote from her notebook: "Hope lives in small things." Agnes, now 84 and frail, attended the opening ceremony in a wheelchair. She wept as she watched children from the village school plant seeds in soil that would have been impossible to cultivate outdoors in the Arctic climate. She would have been so proud, Agnes whispered to the gathered crowd. This is what she wanted. For our people to thrive. 6 months later, in February 2025, Agnes Apassingok passed away peacefully in her sleep. The entire village gathered for her funeral, remembering her not just as Nadia's grandmother, but as a warrior for justice who had refused to let her granddaughter be forgotten. She was buried next to Nadia in the small cemetery overlooking the Beaufort Sea, the two of them reunited at last. The story of Nadia Apassingok's murder and the 15-year quest for justice resonated far beyond Kaktovik. It became a touchstone case in discussions about the MMIP crisis, about the failures of rural policing in Alaska, about the revolutionary potential of genetic genealogy, and about the resilience of Native communities in the face of systemic neglect. Documentaries were produced, articles written, academic papers published. But more importantly, the case became a rallying cry for change. Other Alaska villages followed Kaktovik's lead in applying for VAWA tribal jurisdiction. The Alaska State Troopers expanded their cold case unit, hiring additional investigators specifically tasked with MMIP cases. Federal funding for genetic genealogy in Indigenous cold cases increased. By 2025, 12 additional Alaska cold cases had been solved using the same genetic genealogy techniques that identified Robert Kunak. Families who had waited decades for answers finally learned what happened to their loved ones. Not all the outcomes were as conclusive as Nadia's case. Some suspects had died, others fled Alaska, but even incomplete answers brought a measure of peace. The statistics remained grim. Alaska Native women still experienced violence at rates far exceeding other populations. Rural villages still struggled with delayed law enforcement response times. The jurisdictional maze still complicated prosecution of crimes in Native communities. But the needle had moved. The conversation had shifted. Nadia's case had proven that even in Alaska's vast wilderness, even in the most remote villages, justice could still arrive, even if it took 15 years. Detective Sarah Chern continued her work in the cold case unit, taking on increasingly complex cases. She kept a photograph of Nadia on her desk, a reminder of why the work mattered. In interviews, she often spoke about the importance of never giving up on cold cases, especially those involving Native victims. For too long, there was this assumption that if a case went cold, especially if it involved a Native woman in a remote village, it was just going to stay cold, Chern said in a 2025 interview with the Alaska Public Media. But technology is changing. Our understanding of these systemic failures is changing. And most importantly, families like Agnes's are refusing to let these cases be forgotten. Every cold case represents a person who mattered, a life that had value. My job is to remember that, even when the file is dusty and the evidence is degraded and everyone else has moved on. In Spring Creek Correctional Center, Robert Kunak lived out his days in relative anonymity. He was kept in protective custody for his own safety. Crimes against women, especially Indigenous women, were not looked upon kindly by other inmates, many of whom were themselves Alaska Natives. He rarely received visitors. His mother, who had moved to Oregon years earlier, came once in 2023 but never returned. He spent his time in the prison library, reading, working in the prison kitchen, and maintaining the careful emotional distance from his actions that had allowed him to live freely in Kaktovik for so long. In 2024, a journalist requested an interview with Robert for a long-form article about the case. Robert declined. The journalist asked the prison to convey a question. Did Robert think about Nadia? The response came back through the prison spokesman. Mr. Kunak declines to make any further statements regarding the case. The greenhouse in Kaktovik flourished. In its first year, it produced enough fresh vegetables to supplement the diets of dozens of village families, a significant contribution in a place where fresh produce cost a small fortune to fly in and arrived often wilted and spoiled. Children learned to plant and harvest, connecting to the land in a new way that complemented traditional subsistence activities. Elders came to sit in the warm, humid space during the brutal winter, surrounded by green growing things in the midst of darkness and ice. On the anniversary of Nadia's death each August, the village held a gathering at the greenhouse. People shared memories, told stories, and renewed their commitment to keeping her memory alive. Young women in the village learned about Nadia, about her dreams, about how her murder had sparked changes that protected them. She became more than a victim. She became a symbol of what their community could achieve when they refused to accept injustice. The midnight sun still circled the sky each summer in Kaktovik, casting its strange golden light over the same streets Nadia had walked. But the village had changed. It had permanent police presence now. It had a greenhouse that fed its people. It had a justice system, however imperfect, that had finally delivered accountability. And it had the memory of a young woman whose death had, in the end, meant something. In Alaska's vast wilderness, people still disappear. The geography still imposes its brutal challenges. The systemic inequities that made Nadia's case possible still exist in many forms. But her story proved that geography is not destiny, that justice delayed is not always justice denied, and that even the most remote, neglected communities can demand and receive the protection they deserve. Agnes's final words, spoken at the greenhouse opening just months before her death, became a motto for the continuing fight against the MMIP crisis. We are small in number, but we are not small in worth. We live far from cities, but we are not far from justice. Remember Nadia. Remember all of them. And never, ever stop fighting. The story of Nadia Apassingok is one of tragedy, failure, perseverance, and ultimate justice. It is a story about how a single careless act in an Anchorage coffee shop, Robert Canuck discarding a cup that was collected, tested, and matched, can unravel 15 years of careful hiding. It is a story about how grandmother's love can outlast any system's neglect. And it is a story about how even Alaska's infinite wilderness cannot hide the truth forever. If this case resonated with you, if you believe that every missing person deserves to be remembered and every cold case deserves another look, please subscribe to stay informed about these stories. They matter. The victims matter. And our attention matters. Thank you for listening, and we'll see you in the next video where we continue to shed light on cases hidden in the shadows.